Welcome to the podcast, folks. Happy Friday. First off, let's get to our sponsors. Jen Gilbert and the team want you to know for over 40 years, since 1976, the dedicated realtors of Coldwell Banker Cityside Realty have served Lloydminster and the surrounding area. They are passionate about our community, and they pride themselves on giving back through volunteer opportunities and partnerships as often as they can. We know that home is truly where awesomeness happens. Coldwell Banker Cityside Realty for everything real estate, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Give them a call, 780-875-3343. Foremost, they offer smooth wall grain bins, hopper bottoms, and fuel tanks. They're in stock and manufactured locally. They want to ensure you know they are constructed of the highest quality and engineered for a long life. Delivery is free within 300-kilometer radius of Lloydminster, and you can buy from any of their co-op locations, Lloydminster, Lashburn, or Neilburg. For more information, you can check them out on their website, foremost.ca. HSI Group, they are the local oil field burners and combustion experts that can help make sure you have a compliant system working for you. The team also offers security, surveillance, and automation products for residential, commercial, livestock, and agricultural applications. They use technology to give you peace of mind so you can focus on the things that truly matter. Stop in today at 3902 52nd Street or give Brody or Kim a call at 306-825-6310. Lauren at Art and Soul, the passionate, hardworking lady that she is who does everything for me, can make your family heirloom, your jersey, your favorite piece of artwork come to life. I tell you what, she does amazing work. It'll stand out and hold up to the test of time. She's open Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Give her a call, 780-808-6313, or stop in 5016 39th Street. It's more than just a frame. It's a story. SNP Billboard, shout out to Read 'em Right and the talented Deanna Wandler. And I should give a shout out, to Sean Woodman. He's the guy who has come in and hooked me up with my slogan on the wall and done all the talented work making sure it is just straight and right. And what an amazing job he does. Special thanks, before we start here, special thanks to Lloydminster Archives, who help put together these every second Friday currently, and especially Lynn Smith, who is working tirelessly behind the scenes. She helps line up all the interviews, and I don't know where I'd be without her, so thanks, Lynn. Now, if you're interested in advertising on any of the shows, visit SeanNewmanPodcast.com. In the top right corner, hit the contact button. Send me a little bit about what you're thinking. And we got lots of different options, and I want to find something that can work for the both of us, and we'll get something happening, all right? Now, here is your T-Bar 1 tale of the tape. Originally from Ottawa, Ontario, he spent his life in the educational system, beginning as a single-room school teacher and moving all the way up to become a superintendent. He had moved all across Canada, working in different small towns, villages, cities, and he worked his way to Lloydminster, Alberta, Saskatchewan. Here, he spent 16 years as the Director of Education of the Lloydminster School District. I'm talking about Don Duncan. So buckle up, here we go. So today is July 5th, 2020. I'm sitting across from Don Duncan, so thank you first and foremost for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, this is about your life, so you're the expert. You're going to guide us through it. I guess let's start with life in Ottawa. You were born in Ottawa in 1946, July 31st. What do you remember about growing up in the city of Ottawa?
I remember that Ottawa was a very different place from the city it is now. It was a relatively small city at that point, probably 100,000-ish in population, 2/3 English-speaking, 1/3 French-speaking. So it was very much a bilingual environment, and people had their respective neighborhoods, I suppose, but all in all, it was a very congenial place to grow up.
Did you learn French then growing up?
I did. Don't challenge me on it now. It's been many, many years since I've used it with any fluency. But yes, I had the basic instruction, of course, in public school and high school. But more usefully, I had a job as a grocery clerk in a store that served a clientele that was largely French-speaking. And so I learned the vernacular there. As well, in those days, Ottawa had only one television station, operated by the CBC. And the practice was that alternate days were English or French.
Really?
Yep. And so every second Saturday night, for example, hockey night in Canada was either
English or French.
The Toronto Maple Leafs in English or the Montréal Canadien in French. And that was, again, a good learning context to pick up the language. And then when I went to the University of Ottawa, it was truly a bilingual institution. And the history courses that I took predominantly were typically fairly small in number of students. And if a question were asked in French, it would be answered in French by the professor. If it were asked in English, it would be answered in English by the professor. And so to follow along and capture the content of the course, one had to become.
Otherwise, you're missing half the course.
You're missing half the course. And one doesn't want to do that. So, yeah, it was a great place to grow up and learn our other official language. English-speaking people, by nature, I think, are very lazy when it comes to learning other languages because they don't really have to.
You travel anywhere in the world.
Yeah, that makes it too easy. And so we do tend to become a little bit lazy. And I'm grateful that I had the challenge and the context in which to learn some French.
The hockey player in me wants to know, growing up in Ottawa, watching Montreal one Saturday night and Toronto the next Saturday, what was your favorite team growing up?
Chicago Blackhawks. For no good reason. I like the sweater, I think, basically, but it was red, white, and black. And of course, those were the colors associated with Ottawa teams historically as well. So I don't know. There was no good reason for it, but yeah, that was the team I tended to follow.
How about your parents? I know in reading a little bit about you, your father worked on the railroad.
Yes.
And you had a job on the railroad at one point in time.
Various jobs during the summers. Cleaning coaches. At that time, rail travel was the dominant way of getting around in the country, and there were trains, several trains, Ottawa, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and you could get the transcontinental passing through Ottawa as well. And when the engines pulled in, my job was to do a couple of things. Clean the windshields of the engines for those trains that were through trains. And otherwise, those trains that terminated or originated in Ottawa, all of the coaches and other parlor car and bar car, et cetera, would be parked along the rail yard that at that time was right beside the Rideau Canal. And my job was to clean the coaches. And so that's something that provided good income for a student. That rail yard, by the way, it's a long way from Lloydminster to Ottawa, but if you ever see political broadcasts from Ottawa, and there's the National Conference Centre, where many of these conferences are held. The National Conference Centre is the old Union Station in Ottawa. And that's where I was based for part of my work on the CN. And otherwise, I worked as a hostler's mate, preparing diesels for the road, fueling them up, for example, and making sure the supplies were appropriate in the cab for flares, etc. And one summer I worked as well as a switch tender. In those days, all of the switch lamps in the rail yard were kerosene lamps. And so they had to be filled regularly and lenses cleaned and replaced and so on.
Wait. Switch lamps. You're talking, explain that a little better.
Okay.
Or not better, a little deeper.
Sure. When the engineer wants to take his train from one track to another track or a siding,
right.
It's necessary for a switch to be thrown that moves the track over a little bit so that the flange on the wheels is drawn to the side. And each switch, apart from having a long handle on it for the actual moving of it, had a lamp. And the lamp comprised two different colors. Front and back, if the train would go straight through, there were green lenses.
Right.
On the side, there were red lenses.
So whichever color it was, they knew whether they were turning or going straight. And
Exactly.
that at one point in time was a kerosene lantern.
Exactly. Yeah, inside those lenses was a little reservoir for kerosene and a wick that had to be trimmed properly, of course, and replaced when needed. And so, yeah, the technology has changed somewhat.
It's got to be over, because you would be turning 71 this year, at the end of July?
Actually, I'll be turning 74.
74?
In 4 weeks, yeah.
What year were you born?
46.
46. I was thinking 49.
No.
46. Okay. You've seen a lot of different things over your time. And some of the places you've been, you've seen no electricity to now where we're doing exactly what we're doing in this room. Mm-hmm. What has given you the most pause over a lifetime?
Perhaps the speed of change and how it's accelerating. How, with transportation, for example, going from trains that were relatively slow and not always reliable in terms of scheduling, to moving to much more air travel. And how air travel, my first flight, I remember I and a buddy flew down to Bermuda to visit a friend from Ottawa, and it was an old Super Constellation aircraft, propeller driven, of course, and Ottawa to New York, refuel onto.
What year
Bermuda.
would you have done that?
That was the year I just finished Teachers College, so that would have been 1966, 67, centennial year.
And you flew to Bermuda. That was the first time you'd ever been on a plane. What did you think your first time you got on a plane and taking off and all of a sudden looking out the window and...
Yeah. Air travel then was very different. I mean, it was exciting, just the actual thrill of flying for the first time. But air travel then was a much different experience from what we experience today. There was space between the seats. You wore a jacket and tie probably to travel. There was meal service with real plates and cutlery in those days. And it was very much a luxury means of travel, and luxury, frankly, I wasn't very used to. So it was really an interesting experience.
Is there a type of travel, do you think, right now that even resembles that anymore? Like the luxury side of it? Because when I hear like you get dressed up, it was an occasion to go on a plane.
Yeah.
Do we have anything like that anymore? Like a cruise ship, maybe? But even then, you don't really get dressed up to go on that, do you?
Some people do. I've long since given up getting dressed up. I had enough of that, and it's not really who I am. And but I know for the one cruise that my wife and I took a few years back, there were people who took suitcase upon suitcase with different costumes that they would wear, some much more formal than others. And, well, okay, if that's how they get their enjoyment, good on them. But again, for me, it's not authentic. It's not who I am.
You mentioned, or you talk about in your biography you've started on, about when you were young, a bakery around the corner, and the draft horses. Could you lead us down that for a little bit?
Yeah. We lived on Rosemere Avenue in Ottawa East, and about 2 blocks away was Walker's Bakery. And it was a large bakery, and the smell of fresh bread every day, it was just wonderful in the neighborhood. And as a 2-year-old, I took it upon myself, me and my trusty dog Skipper, to go down and see the horses, because in those days, bread, and milk for that matter, was delivered door to door by horse-drawn wagons, and each bakery or dairy kept its own stable of draft horses,
So the bakery had a stable of draft horses.
Yes, yeah. And it was, as I say, about 2 blocks from where I lived as a toddler. And every day I'd see the bread wagon or the milk wagon, coming down the street. And I thought, well, okay, I'll go and see where they go. So I trundled off, unbeknownst to my mother.
Giving her a heart attack.
Oh, gosh, I could only imagine. And so the dog and I walked down. One of the neighbors, which was a good thing, I suppose, and everybody knew everybody else, of course, in the neighborhood, phoned my mother, and are you missing a small boy and a large dog? And I was put on the map at that point and fetched pretty quickly. But yeah, it was a wonderful neighborhood to grow up in.
You also mentioned the Sea Cadets. I picked that out of the things you talked about. It allowed you to go different places and experience. I would assume you had some learning on those trips and being a part of that organization.
Yeah. I don't know if the military culture in Canada is as prominent as it was back in the 60s. We were much closer to the war years at that point. And so there was more awareness, I guess, and engagement with military or things quasi-military in Quebec. I joined the Sea Cadets and enjoyed the challenges. I enjoyed the camaraderie of the situation. I enjoyed the structure. I became a petty officer in the ranks. I was the second highest ranking cadet, I guess, in the Corps. But yeah, wonderful opportunities. Travel down to Cape Breton to North Sydney, Point Edward Naval Base at that time. It's closed now, of course. And spent some weeks there doing, essentially boot camp type training and developing skills, some signaling skills and sailing skills on the harbor, and seeing a part of the country that at that time I wasn't aware was one of the home areas, at least briefly, for my great-great-grandfather, and in North Sydney. And so again, it gave me a chance to experience that travel.
When you were away, it isn't like today where you got FaceTime and, I don't know, everybody's got a cell phone to talk to your parents. How did you stay in touch with your parents, or did they just wait for you to come home?
They waited for me to come home. And again, I think one of the qualities that has helped me over the years is a wee bit of a sense of independence. That whatever situation I'm in, I want to participate in that situation, and not be distracted by people or things far away. I'll get to them, and when I'm there, I'll be engaged, but not constantly. And I think, one of the benefits of that kind of an experience is that you learn to live with yourself. You come to understand who you are and what your strengths and weaknesses are. And you're not in a position or a situation where you're constantly defined by other people's opinions or expectations of you. And that's a good thing. I see young people nowadays, captured, actually addicted to their electronic devices, and very much sensitive to the opinions of their friends, some of whom are real friends, many of whom aren't, and whatever the expectations of that audience might be, tend to shape who the individual is. And that's not good. We need to understand how we're influencing or affected by others, but we can't constantly let them define us.
It's very interesting in my short time, because I remember a time where I didn't like people being able to get a hold of me. That was only like 14 years ago. Didn't have a cell phone, didn't have one of those contraptions, and I remember having jobs where if you were off on the weekend, work wasn't getting a hold of you because you were at the lake or you were off on whatever, and if they called the house and you didn't pick up, what could they really do?
Exactly.
And now you raise an interesting point, because the thing is almost as much a part of you as anything else in life, because everybody has one now. If you don't, you're kind of the odd person that doesn't have a cell phone. And on top of that, if you don't answer immediate gratification of like sending a text or a phone call, if they don't answer, they don't call you back, or they don't text you immediately, you're almost hurt by that, because you expect them at any hour, any time. It's the cell phone is the ability to pretty much be anywhere and be contactable.
Yeah.
And that is something that, for a lot of years of your life, your generation grew up where for majority of their life it wasn't like that. And any kid now from essentially 2000 on, maybe late 90s even on, That is not the case anymore.
Well, and the drawbacks, I mentioned the fact that people tend to allow their character to be shaped more by the opinions of others than their true character. The other drawback, I think, of modern communication with its instant gratification is that it causes us to be lazy, mentally lazy. And so, for example, if somebody tries to get you now and needs an answer right away, and they can't get you, if it's a significant situation, then the challenge to them is to figure it out for themselves and take responsibility for it. And now, that laziness, I guess, and refusal to accept responsibility diminishes, I think, us as people. I find, this is a related example, I guess, that I have a Garmin GPS device that if I'm traveling somewhere, I'll sometimes use it if I'm trying to get from point A to point B in an unfamiliar country. But I only use it when I have to. I much rather look at a map and visualize where it is I'm going and what time I want to get there and what route I should take and things I should avoid, etc., etc. And then when I'm driving, I'm watching. Oh, okay, there's the sign for whatever, or how many miles or kilometers to the destination. And I'm thinking, I'm there, and I'm observing. If I have the GPS on, it's almost like I'm mentally on autopilot, where
It's doing the work for you.
it's doing the work. I'm just here to steer and use the accelerator or the brake, and I really don't have to pay close attention to where I am and what's happening. And again, that becomes a mental habit. Let the technology look after it, or let somebody else look after it if I have a question, because I can get them immediately and I know they'll respond. And, again, that diminishes us as authentic people.
Yeah. I always say, if a guy could have Don and his father, and then his father's father, and then his father's father all sit in the same room and have a conversation, I'm sure every generation would look to the one previous would look at you and go, you don't even know how to do this. But it go all the way down to us, and yourself, you probably look at your kids and do the same thing, right?
To a degree.
To a degree. I always loved the map, because it felt like you were an explorer, right? Like if you could figure out the map and you get lost, you figure it out yourself. There's a sense of accomplishment in that. I got from here to there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you bring up GPS, because you just don't even think about it anymore. Now it's on your phone, right? You don't even need to buy a Garmin anymore to have
Exactly.
Everything is programmed into the phone.
Yeah.
The phone can pretty much, a lot of people are lost without that device. I always talk about when I was growing up, I wrote down all my friends' home phone numbers on a piece of paper. That was your phone book. And for you, maybe you actually had like a little black book where you wrote down people's names, and that was your contact book. Mm-hmm. Now if you ask a single soul what anybody's number is, well,
it's right here.
It's right here. Nobody has an idea anymore.
No. And again, they don't have to put their brain through the mental exercise of learning these things. And the point is, too, that, even the physical activity of writing something down, it activates a different part of the brain. It reinforces the thinking process that you engage in, and surprise, surprise, you end up with higher quality thinking as a consequence. And so, if among the concerns that I would have for future generations is becoming over-dependent on the artificial intelligence that's available to serve us, and the price that we as individuals pay in diminishing our own capacity by using it.
Man, we've got down a rabbit hole right now, so I apologize. All I ever think about now when I get going on this is Lynn always goes, somebody's got to write this all down, and they're sitting here writing me down as we go. But what you're talking about is in school, we read a book, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was talking about kids forgetting how to do math because they used a calculator all the time. Yeah. And this is back probably, I was in Hillmont at the time, so late 90s maybe. Mm-hmm. And it got to the point where they no longer flew planes, robots flew planes, and they were trying to teach themselves how to do that all over again, and this is years way in the future. And you think, at the time I remember thinking as a kid, oh, we'll never forget how to do long-form math. Like, oh my goodness, like give it a rest. But now you got a genius of a computer that goes with every kid. Like I say, I keep pointing at the phone because nobody can see that, but the phone can do pretty much anything for you right now. And it will be interesting to see what happens with 10 years in advance, 40 years in advance, 50 years, 100 years.
Well, this gets back to what I said earlier in terms of the accelerating pace of change. And the challenge among the challenges is for us as a civilization or as a society, as Canadians, to decide who is really in charge of not only the rate of change, but the direction of change. And who owns the product of all of those changes. And as we diminish the engagement of real people and real brains, who profits, who loses, and who controls? Should, and again, I think we're going off on a tangent here, but who regulates Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and are they following or pursuing what is technologically possible without giving enough thought to the values associated with the technology? And I'm afraid that we're letting technology run rampant and taking control of our lives in many, many ways to the detriment of our humanity.
Where do you think it goes then in the next 20 years?
Oh gosh, it depends how much smarter we as a society become in regulating the applications of artificial intelligence and the other sciences, the biological sciences, the genetic science, for example. We need to take an interest as citizens as to where all of this is going. And if we don't take an interest, then I'm afraid we end up somewhere where we never planned to go, and we end up subjugated by the technology that controls us. The fragility of our society increases year by year as the sophistication of the technology increases. Just imagine if the electricity were to shut off right now.
We'd be hooped.
We'd be hooped. This interview, of course, would stop.
That would be a way of putting it politely.
Yeah. But what would work in the city of Lloydminster if there were no electricity available? If all of a sudden we were off the grid or there were no grid? And again, as things become more technically sophisticated, their fragility by definition increases. And we may be putting ourselves in a situation where we rely overmuch on the technology that could at some point fail us. I think in terms of the skills that our ancestors had, either centuries ago or even as recently as 50 years ago. The ability to, build something ourselves with hand tools, for example. The ability to know how to build a fire properly. Where to find fuel, how to get food when you don't have the supermarket down the street. All of those things, we're setting aside in favor of the convenience of technology. And I'm not a Luddite. I'm not suggesting we get rid of technology, but I'm suggesting that we better understand it and control it before it controls us.
Let's go then to, I got so many questions that come out of that, but I think of when you talk about what would life look like with no electricity. My brain pops to Collins, Ontario. And I thought maybe you could give the listeners an idea. I've read the story. I find it absolutely fascinating. And I could be wrong. I said this before we started, that when I look back at a person's life and I go, I bet they got one thing that just sticks out like that was a time. Collins, Ontario has to be it for you. And maybe there's multiple after that, but let's share the journey to Collins and then life in Collins.
Okay. Well, the preamble, I guess, to Collins was that my first year of teaching as an elementary school teacher was in Ottawa. And I never had fewer than 42 kids in my grade 4 or 5 split classroom. Although I did okay and the school system was happy with my work, it was not a rewarding place to work as a teacher. It was much more babysitting than teaching, given the numbers involved. And I ended up, as a consequence, resigning that position, going downtown in Ottawa to Laurier Avenue, where at that time the Department of Indian Affairs office was located, Indian and Northern Affairs, and checked in to find out what they might have by way of teaching opportunities. I was given, my choice of half a dozen different locations, some as far as Tavani and Whale Cove up in the Arctic, to other reserves that were situated in the south. The personnel officer at the time said, well, if you're leaving Ottawa mainly because you had too many students in your class, we have a school, it's a one-room school in northwestern Ontario, where there were only 4 students this past year. And there are no roads into the village, but it's on the CN main line. If you want it, it's yours. And being very naive and ignorant, I jumped at the opportunity. And so in August, took the train from Ottawa. It was about a 22-hour trip from Ottawa to Collins in northwestern Ontario. Collins was a village of about 100 people if everyone were home. It was an Ojibwe village. There was a trading post there run by Peter Patience, and Peter was as he described himself, a half-breed. We would say Métis nowadays. And his father was a Scot and his mother was Ojibwe. His wife was Ojibwe. And Peter sort of ran the village in many respects, in a positive way. So anyway, about 11:30 at night, I stepped off the train, the Transcontinental. One could get it to stop anywhere along the way, really, in those days. And so I got a stop at Collins, and they unloaded all the stuff from the baggage car down to the side of the track. Peter and half a dozen other guys and I hauled the material down to my teacherage, which was about 50 meters away from the tracks. And that's where it became my home for 2 years.
What did your family say when you were going here?
They, I'm sure, wondered what on earth I was thinking. You have to understand that there was, if today we have very little awareness of Aboriginal culture and communities, back then there was virtually none. They were a different solitude altogether. And so as white people, we really knew nothing about Aboriginal culture and communities. And so they just, I'm sure, couldn't understand why on earth I would want to go and live in the middle of the bush without any amenities.
Why did you want to go live in the bush with no amenities? You're talking no electricity?
Yeah.
At times no running water? A one-room schoolhouse, which you thought was 4 kids, but turns out to be 32?
Yeah.
In the middle of nowhere, where it gets to minus 40, by yourself, not a friend, not a... What was it about that made you jump at that?
Well, remember that little 2-year-old who went on his walk independently. The 21-year-old was the same guy. And again, I have always been comfortable with myself, and it was a good chance to be somewhere in a totally different cultural environment, a different language environment. Peter and family could speak English, of course, but most of the families, the language was Ojibwe. And the kids had a smattering of English. And remember, that was before there was television or even reliable radio service, for that matter. So, the inundation of mainstream culture hadn't occurred. And so it was a matter of being in the environment and observing it, recognizing that, I had a role there, but I wasn't really part of it. And that's an important quality or skill, I think, that I would encourage people to develop. By all means, be engaged, but if you can at the same time stand back and observe yourself in that setting and come to understand who you are there, if that makes any sense.
Certainly.
It again, just helps with one's intellectual understanding, I think.
I would assume. Most people don't think like that 10 years ago, let alone right now. But we have too many distractions. We're too busy.
Yeah.
I just think you go to the middle of nowhere, Ontario. Like I played hockey in Dryden. I've been to Sioux Lookout.
Yeah.
And Sioux Lookout is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. And when I looked on the map to where Collins, Ontario is, and I suggest to anyone who's listening to this do the same, it is in the middle of nowhere. So you have you have things to occupy your time. You could go fishing or do the trails, or I'm sure there was other things, but there was no, satellite TV. There was no phone. There was no million different things. You talked that you didn't even have, contact really with the outside world. So you were in a segregated little area with a small population of people. That had to have been many a night where you either sat around talking to people or many a night of reading books or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And getting to self-reflect, which most people don't get that much time to self-reflect or don't want that much time anymore to self-reflect.
True. And, again, it's if you choose not to self-reflect, then you're handing over control of who you are to somebody else. And that's never a good thing. We didn't have the distractions. You're absolutely right. But again, the wonderful thing about living in that environment was that it was a chance for me to learn about things that I was totally unaware of. I'd go out with the kids, walking. The kids would say, I set some rabbit snares along such and such a trail. And I had never set rabbit snares in my life, living in the city, of course. And so we'd go out, and the kids would say, right there, there's the snare. And I'd look and I couldn't even see it, let alone know how to make one. But, as I paused and looked, okay, I see the snare now with the brass wire, and I see how we called them rabbit roads, how the little branches had been put to funnel
them in
the rabbit into the snare, and so I learned from the kids, and I learned things about their culture and their language. And because I was willing to pause and watch and listen, they were willing to show me things that were totally beyond my experience. And so I learned some Ojibwe. I would never claim to be fluent. I learned how to read and write syllabics, which is that set of symbols that replaces our alphabet for many Aboriginal languages. I was able to teach syllabics to the kids as well, having learned it. And it was a wonderful experience.
How about getting water in -40?
That's, again, something one learns how to do.
Certainly, the first time you went down to the ice and pounded a hole through, you must have been thinking, what on earth have I got myself into?
Yeah, well, there was a gasoline-powered water pump in the house that had a character of its own, and there was a shallow well in front of the teacherage, and that was fine until the weather got very cold. And then it was a matter of fetching water from the lake. And thank goodness the lake water was still drinkable in those days. So what one would do, when I got up in the morning in the wintertime, I'd take the big square wash tub, put it on the toboggan, take it down to the lake, And one had, his family's or his own ice hole, water hole, that was chopped into the ice. And of course, because of the climate, the ice got pretty thick, and so you didn't want to have to chop through a meter of ice every time you wanted to get water. So I'd take the wash tub down, fill it with a pail from the hole that I'd cleared out, and just leave it. Because if I had taken it up on the toboggan back up to the teacherage, it would have sloshed out by the time I got it up to the house. So I'd leave it and let it freeze, and then at lunchtime I'd go down, and there was enough ice formed on the top at that point.
It no longer sloshed.
It didn't slosh. I didn't lose a drop. I'd take it back.
How many times did you have to do that before you realized that's the way to do it?
Well, again, you watch and you learn, and you see other people doing it. And similarly, how do you look after your water hole? Could you
communicate? They spoke Ojibwe.
Yeah.
And you couldn't, at the beginning, you couldn't understand?
Not a word.
So that right there reminds me of when I was playing hockey in Finland. I couldn't speak Finnish.
Yes.
So you have to wrap your brain around watching everything that happens in order to make it.
Yeah.
For lack of a better term.
Yeah.
So that's the way you approached everything there then, I assume, because you watched them how they got water. Oh, they left it there. Why did they leave it there?
Yeah.
And then you watch them take it up the next time, and you're like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. And, how do you save yourself an awful lot of work chopping through ice? Well, once you've taken the water out, you fill the hole with snow. And the snow serves as a really good insulator. And the next time you go down, you don't have much chopping to do. You just have to take out the snow and the slush. And, if there's been a snowstorm and a lot of drifting, and so where is the hole? Well, you take a little spruce bough and you plant it there so that you know where to go.
Flagpole.
Exactly. And again, there are things we can learn if we pay attention to other people.
And that is something that you have to do when you can't speak the language.
Yeah.
Because they can't simply just sit there and go, hey, just leave it that full, let it freeze because then it won't slosh. You go, oh, yeah, that's great. Like you don't have that ability when they don't speak the same language.
Well, exactly. And, there was a smattering. I won't say there was no English whatsoever. People did have enough language to cope, but their first language was certainly Ojibwe.
I had to chuckle because when you told, I think it's, if I remember correctly, when you told the conductor where you were heading, you said it's Hollywood.
Yeah.
Could you just tell me that story?
Sure. They changed the conductor and crew at Armstrong, which is the station just east of Collins. And so the new conductor got on and, walked down the coach. And where are you going? Well, I'm going to Collins. We call that Hollywood around here because that's where all the characters live. And I thought, ooh, okay. Well, I'm not sure what kind of characters particularly. But Collins, even though there were only about 100 people in the village, every human quality, every human failing was to be found there. Alcohol abuse was a problem in the community, and of course that often would lead to violence of various sorts, and even to one murder that I was aware of. People, again, they were very distinctive as individuals, and again, interesting to observe and learn from that range of characters.
You had a word that I really enjoy in your writings about Collins, and one of them was persistence. You talked about getting a diesel generator because at times the school, no matter how many lamps you had, there wasn't enough light. Imagine this, people, and wasn't enough light to even read for the kids. So you got a schoolhouse and you can't even do work. How much effort did it take? And is that something? It seemed like a characteristic you've had all your life, is something where when you wanted something, you just went after it, and a simple no was never enough to stop you. And I find that intriguing.
We live in a society that in many respects is too much governed by bureaucracies. Collins, even though the school had been there for, I don't know how many years, had never been electrified. That was problematic because cold winter mornings that were overcast, I could be there, the kids could be there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and by and large, we were all there. But you couldn't do anything in the classroom because it was just too dull. You couldn't read a book until things got brighter outside. And in a bureaucracy, the further away you are from a problem, the easier it is to ignore it. And so as the teacher there, it was my problem. And so when I asked the regional office folks in Thunder Bay, what can you do to get us a generator? Well, that's all done in Ottawa, and has to be budgeted for, and the budget's already in for this year, etc. What?
Pass the buck along.
Every excuse you can imagine. And for my predecessors, I guess, that kind of excuse was acceptable.
What you find, Don, is that stops probably 96% of people in the world even today.
Yeah.
A simple no, it's impossible, and they walk away.
Yeah.
They don't think any further on it.
But almost anything's possible.
100%.
Yeah. And so I was fortunate, I must say, at Christmas time, being a resident of Ottawa, and I went home for Christmas. I went down to Laurier Avenue to Indian Affairs office, found the office that is responsible for engineering projects, and I made my case. And they listened politely, but didn't do anything, of course. Again, it was, part of a budget process, blah, blah. And at Easter time, I went down for the holiday again, back to the same office. And I guess they had run out of novel excuses to give and didn't really want to see me there another time. And so they made the arrangements. And so after my first year in the summer holidays, when I got back, the crew was there installing lights in the classroom and electrifying the teacherage. It was a totally different place. And we were able, every Friday night, we'd order movies in. I ordered a 16 millimeter projector. And again, nowadays, who uses film in a projector? But, I got a projector and we would order movies from the distributor in Winnipeg. And they'd come, Winnipeg, Sioux Lookout, onto the way freight, and to Collins. And we'd show the movie in the schoolhouse. Whoever was in the village would crowd in. We'd enjoy oh gosh, a Western or whatever was popular in the day.
Do you remember what the first movie was you showed?
Ooh, I believe it was a movie that was a biography of, oh gosh, who sang the country and Western song, Your Cheatin' Heart?
Oh, now you're racking my brain.
Well, it was before your time, obviously, but whoever that was, an American country and Western singer who ended up in pretty dire straits because of alcohol.
Hank Williams.
Hank Williams. That, I believe, was among the first movies that we got in.
If you go back to that time when you just introduced power for the first time to a community and a movie what was the atmosphere like with everyone? Were they over the moon?
Oh, it was something everyone looked forward to. Again, there weren't a whole lot of other entertainments available. It made the school a much more significant part of the community. It wasn't just something that the government imposed on them. And believe me, in those days, the policies were impositions on Aboriginal people. Again, policies set by people who had vague cultural goals, i.e. to convert all of the Aboriginal people into productive white people in society. And of course, that was an impossible goal to achieve and an inappropriate one. But that wasn't necessarily obvious at the time. It just helped me become part of the community as well.
You mentioned trying to convert a way of life into what we know. You spent, and I don't know the exact amount of years, but you weren't from Collins. I'm probably going to torture the name. Wabaquai?
To Webequay.
Webequay for a couple months.
Yeah, on mat leave.
Fort Hope.
Fort Hope.
Garden Hill, Sandy Bay.
Yeah.
Like, you spent a large chunk of your life on reserve schools?
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Collins wasn't on a reserve per se. It was on Crown land, but it was a federal school, interestingly. Something of an anomaly.
So I find talking to you, you have a very knowledgeable background in a prominent issue today.
Yeah.
First Nations people are put onto reserves. There are problems there. That problem gets expounded now, and social media has put a divide between everyone. I just find you come from a very unique perspective. I could sit here and try and waddle my way through the issue, but the truth of the matter is I haven't done half of what you've done. I've read a few books. That's better than a lot of people, but not good enough to sit and try and truly dissect and figure out what to do there. Coming from all the years you've seen of going through the different communities, is there a way to walk back out of that, or is it just a very giant issue facing our society?
It's a very giant issue indeed, and there's not an easy road out of the challenges. You have to appreciate, and this is something I did come to appreciate, the Aboriginal cultures, and there were many depending on the part of the country you lived in. The Aboriginal cultures evolved over thousands of years, and they evolved to be successful in their respective environments, in natural environment as well as social environment. And so the family groups, for example, and again, people in our society, our white society, don't understand this well. The family units were the bases of survival in the bush. Every family would typically have its traditional hunting and trapping area. And the families would come together at treaty time or prior to the arrival of white society. They would get together for certain cultural festivals, I guess, but then they'd go back out. They didn't have to develop the social interaction skills that are needed for someone to survive in an urban environment. They didn't have to develop the governance structures that are so important to keeping our lives in order and services provided. They were relatively independent units as family units. And they had those skills and they served them well for centuries. And then our society invaded and tried to change in the guise of improving their lot in life. We changed their way of life. But we didn't do it in a thoughtful manner. We created reserves and drew people in for education or health services, such as they were. But the people didn't have the social skills to deal with that congregated setting. The people had to learn those. They didn't have the governance structure. You know, we talk about nowadays chief and band council and so on, as though they were the same as the mayor and city council. They weren't, and they aren't in many situations. The affiliation of those individual family units was very, very loose to any kind of formal band or tribal organization. People would join and leave. They would, associate with this respected chief for a while. If they got tired of that association, they would more associate with this family cluster over here. And so there was that informality of connection. And again, so foreign to our, democratic institutions that we're so accustomed to. And when government policy and drew these people in, they were lacking in the governance and in interaction skills. And I don't say that in a demeaning way, but they just hadn't developed them to work in that urban environment. And to top it all off, the reserves never or rarely had economic resources or opportunities to provide any kind of a dignified existence on the reserve. And so the effects of abject poverty were piled on top of the challenges of a radically different social context for which people were not prepared. And that's not even to talk about the effects of residential schools. That's another story altogether. But Fort Hope was an interesting place. I was principal there for 3 years. It was initially a 6 and then ultimately an 8-room school. And by and large, it was a relatively successful school in a relatively stable social environment in Fort Hope. Fort Hope was a relatively new settlement. Things hadn't had a chance to deteriorate badly in a social or governance sense. People were still in the building phase of their community. But unfortunately, over time, what was a fairly positive environment. I watch the news and I read about the addiction problems for OxyContin that beset, it's estimated, about half of the village population or the town population at this point. And, again, that's a function, amongst other things, of misguided government policies, abject poverty, and desperation on the part of the people there.
You can tell it means a lot to you.
Yeah. Yeah, how do you fix something that you were a part of breaking?
That's a big question. I think when it comes to the size of the problem, it's not one community. It's
No.
Systematic. It's bigger than one thing. But I think, and I'm half your age, experience less than half of what you've done, especially in some of the communities you went through. But you've been in leadership roles, and I think leadership, especially at the highest of levels, you really need to understand what your choices and how they're going to impact. And if you've never experienced some of the things you've experienced, how can you possibly know? And so to fix problems, the complicated procedure that might have to, or that would have to go on, you'd have to have some incredibly smart, experienced people. And I don't know that you can get a room full of those people together.
No, it's very difficult. It's difficult to find those who have the tools or wherewithal to develop policy or provide resources. It's difficult to find people who understand the problem. It's difficult as well, and again, it's presumptuous and stupid, frankly, for an outsider to think that he can fix somebody else's problem. Even if we as a society were part of creating that problem. It's only the Aboriginal people who are going to be able to address the issues that dominate life on reserves. Again, our society took hundreds, if not thousands of years to evolve its understanding of the value of democracy. And, as a student of history, I have an inkling of how imperfect our democracies have been over the years. Go back 100 years, well, a little over 100 years. And who had the franchise to vote? Well, it was only men. Go back a few years beyond that, and it was only men of a certain wealth. Gradually, we have learned that there are better ways of organizing our society and governing it. And we've made all of the mistakes along the way. All of the possible stupid things that could have been done were done. And as societies, we've worked our way through those. And although we're certainly imperfect now in our political structures, we've come a long, long way. People living, especially in remote reserves, haven't had those centuries to evolve their understandings and practices in democratic institutions. There's a tendency in some communities to use political power for, if not personal gain, at least the gain of one's family or connected people. And in too many reserves, there's always an in-group and an out-group. And then maybe the next election, they switch places. But again, there's a challenge. You have to appreciate that when you've got local control, you've got local responsibility. And that responsibility is to all of the people in the community.
Nepotism. I read it. You taught me a word yesterday. I love learning new words. Nepotism was one that you'd written about, yeah. And I read it, and I understood it in the sentence, but I hadn't, and I say it, and then I'm not saying the definition. So nepotism is the practice among those with power or influence of favoring relatives or friends, especially by giving them jobs.
Yeah. And I think in terms of the 1 year that I spent at Garden Hill Reserve in northern Manitoba as principal of the school there, and the school at that time was still an Indian Affairs school, but the policy was to encourage the development of a local school committee and give as much control as possible to that committee in the running of the school. Well, a school is there first and foremost to serve the learning needs of the children. But in a context where there aren't enough jobs to support a community, those jobs become real plums to hand out. And in that setting, there was a tendency for those plums to be given to the relatives of those with political power in the village. Regardless of the competence of the individual. And I had relatively high standards and expectations of people working in the school. And if a job had been given to someone who wasn't prepared for it, who didn't really care particularly about serving the students, but they were there because they were the chief's nephew, then we had problems. So although I'd say all of the places I worked were satisfying in many ways, Garden Hill was the one exception.
What I find, or why nepotism stuck out to me, especially when I read it, and I was like, that's an interesting word, is you don't have to look just at reserves to see that. You can go pretty much anywhere in any walk of life and see nepotism.
Yes.
politics is by far one that's easy to follow along and see what it has done there. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of power and ability to do things at that level.
Yeah.
And if you follow that, you can see it anywhere or everywhere.
There are some very recent examples of that in the Alberta government, aren't there?
There certainly are. You know, we've been talking an awful lot about your time, and I want to make sure that we talk about some other things, because there are some other things in your life that are pretty significant. And I think we talked about before we hopped on, you're about to celebrate your 50th wedding anniversary to Louise?
Lois.
Of course, I had to say the wrong one. Lois. Let's talk about some happy times. Not that the other ones, your experiences aren't. But let's talk about Lois here. How did you meet her?
Okay. Back years ago, it was possible for one to become a teacher with 1 year of teacher college training after high school in Ontario.
So go to school for 1 year, and here's your degree. Go start teaching kids.
Yeah, it wasn't a degree; it was a teaching certificate. But yes, and that's the program that I could afford.
When you go to college, then how much are you making off a 1 year teaching degree?
Well, that was my second year of teaching.
Or sorry, second. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
My first year in Ottawa, I made $3,800 for the year.
For the year. Okay.
In Collins, because of the isolation pay, etc., I made $4,200 for the year.
And was that good money?
It was. And the reason I would say that is that when I compare my earnings in my second year of teaching, I made more in that 1 year than my father ever made as a clerk working for the CNR for his entire career. And so, relatively speaking, it wasn't a bad salary.
Say that again. You made more money than your father did.
Yeah, after working as a clerk for the CNR for, I don't know, let's say 30 years at that point, 25 years, his annual salary was less than what I made with my $4,200 in my second year. Yeah. And so, again, you can only say whether something is a good or a poor salary in relation to. Yeah. So that's the gauge that I use. Okay.
Well, then let's go back to your wife
Lois. Yeah.
Yes, let's go back to Lois.
So anyway, because I only had very limited training and formal education, during the summers, I would go back and knock off a couple of university courses as I worked on my Bachelor of Arts degree at that point. And after 2 years in Collins, I went back for a full year to the University of Ottawa. And it was during that year that mutual friends introduced Lois and I. And over the course of several months, we found each other quite acceptable. And
I love when I talk to people around your age. Acceptable comes up all the. We were acceptable. What does acceptable mean?
We got along well. We understood each other. We tolerated each other as individuals.
What did you do for your first date? Do you remember your first date?
Yeah. It was a party that I hosted over at my mother's house, actually, down in our rec room in the basement, and just a small gathering of friends, and Lois came along with one of her friends. Lois was a laboratory technologist at the Ottawa Civic Hospital, and one of her acquaintances in the same program was the girlfriend of a chap I took some courses with at the University of Ottawa. And so, as mutual friends do, they set us up and we went on from there.
When you talk about dating someone or getting married to somebody, the words I keep hearing are acceptable and tolerate. Compared to today, I feel like you're looking for the needle in the haystack. Well, and maybe you were back then too. I shouldn't overstate that. But I don't hear acceptable or tolerate anymore when people are looking for a companion. Was marriage looked at differently, do you think, back then?
I think interpersonal relationships were much less casual than they are now, in the sense that even from the point of view of engaging in sexual activity, birth control was not commonly available in those days, and I think many people were much more cautious about their relationships than they are nowadays. So, there wasn't that instant hookup that I think may be popular in most circles today. It tended not to be done. And I think in many respects we were closer to some of the traditional values, if you like, of our forefathers, foremothers. So again, there was a little more reserve, perhaps, in the relationships than less familiarity. Instant familiarity was typically not there.
So what was it about Lois then that drew you in?
She was bright. She, again, seemed to pay attention to who I was. Again, we were able to share ideas and thoughts and understandings. And she had a little bit of an adventurous spirit as well, knowing that I was going to be in Ottawa for a year, and then it was back up to the bush. She was someone adventurous enough to take the risk of going into, again, what was for her a very foreign environment. She grew up on a dairy farm outside of Ottawa, a very small community, very much with its own cultural traditions, settled by Irish and Scots settlers. She had no knowledge of Aboriginal people whatsoever. I'm not sure she had even met one. And she was willing to take a chance and come with me as my wife to again, if you thought Collins was in the middle of nowhere, Fort Hope was 125 miles northeast of there. And a fly-in location. No roads.
No bedding the first night either.
No bedding the first night.
I can imagine you may have heard a few choice words about that.
No. Again, it was a matter of attitude. Well, how are we going to make this work? So we did. Again, a degree of self-reliance, I guess, is the key.
How did you propose?
How did I propose? We went up on a drive into the Gatineau Hills north of Ottawa, stopped at a lookout there, and I asked if she would marry. And
did you have the ring already? Or did you?
I did. I did. And, it was modest, I suppose, by many standards, because although my salary was okay, it didn't allow luxuries particularly, but it was sufficient to the occasion.
How was the wedding? How many people, size? Was it in Ottawa?
No, it was in Lois's home village of North Gore, Ontario, which is about 20 miles south of Ottawa. And the wedding was conducted in an Anglican church because the checkered religious affiliations of her family, whether they were Presbyterian or Anglican, was moot decade to decade. So anyway, nominally, Lois was a member of the Anglican Church. I was previously a member of the Presbyterian Church. We met her and her family's expectations, I guess, in terms of going through the instruction that is was the premarital instruction given by the local Anglican clergyman. One of the parts of the Anglican ceremony that Lois noted without a lot of zeal. It used to say in the Book of Common Prayer, I don't know if it still does, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. She's willing to engage and collaborate, but submission is not a watchword that she would readily use.
I've always argued with my wife in favor of submission. I married my wife because she's one of the smartest women I've ever met.
Yeah.
And to not approach it that way, you lose half of the equation. And she has a different perspective and a very smart perspective from mine.
Yeah.
When you get two smart minds working on a problem from different angles, you can usually figure it out. And why on earth would you ever quiet one side and say it's on my way or the highway? It made no sense to me.
It makes no sense whatsoever, because if you have only one smart mind available, it tends to become arrogant and it tends to go down a wrong path. And there's no one there to catch you and say, hey, take a look here. There's got to be another way. If you're very fortunate, you will be connected with a spouse with that perspective and ability.
Your first child, when she is born, you are nowhere near
her. Yeah.
Her. Sorry. Yes, sorry. You're up north, and Lois is in Ottawa, correct?
Yeah. We were at that time. I was beginning my principalship in Garden Hill Reserve in northeastern Manitoba at Island Lake. And of course, there weren't any maternity facilities available there. And so we thought it best if Lois stayed behind, where we did have family in Ottawa. And so, Josie was born in September and at Riverside Hospital in Ottawa. Again, there's a communications difference. Back then, Island Lake was served by a radio phone. A radio phone that was over actually in the Hudson Bay store on the island nearby the reserve. And it was, first of all, it was over the radio waves. Anything that was broadcast was anything but private. Secondly, it was subject to atmospheric interference.
So if it wasn't a perfect weather day, you were pooched.
Exactly. And so in the end, the word of Josie's birth got to me 3 days after the fact, brought in by one of the pilots flying for St. Andrews Airways, who came into the community.
I don't know if difficult is the right word, but how tough was that to be sitting so far away from the birth of your first child and not having 3 of my own, almost missing the first one by how quickly he came?
Yeah.
I read that and I found, man, that must have been difficult.
Well, you wonder, just where things are in the process and how people are doing. And, I had every confidence that things would go well, and that there was adequate support available. And there was. But, one is distracted, certainly, by those musings. And I was very pleased and relieved to ultimately get the message. Even with the birth of our second child, Kayla, I missed that one as well. We were living on Sandy Bay Reserve in southern Manitoba at that point, about 60 miles north of Portage la Prairie. Lois went in the night before, and I was supposed to be called as the birth was imminent. The message never got out to me, and so again I arrived a wee bit late for for that birth as well, and but at least the same day, and so that was an improvement.
Back then, were the men in the delivery room with the women giving birth?
Absolutely not. No.
I was thinking that. So as big of a deal as it was that you weren't there for yourself,
Yeah.
you weren't supposed to be in the delivery room anyway. So
No.
it wasn't like you were missing out on that part. You were missing out on being around after the child had been born.
Yeah.
Or after your daughters had been born.
Yes. And, again, one had the satisfaction, I suppose, of being at hand. You were down the hall in the waiting room kind
That's
of
right.
thing. And could go in at a suitable point. But it was a very clinical process. It was something between the mother and the doctors at that point. Husbands were not involved, and were not welcome to become involved at that stage.
Did you think that was ridiculous at the time? Do you wish you could have been in the delivery room, or you're like, you know what, I don't really need to be in there?
No, I think the latter is more more the case.
I'll say this: I'm not a queasy guy,
Yeah.
but on Casey, our last one born, they had to put a chair there, and I had to sit in it with my head pretty much in between my legs because it's a stressful time, and I kudos and hats off to every single woman out there who gives birth, because that process is not an easy one.
Yes, and I'm sure I would not have been helpful in the circumstances.
Over 50 years, coming up on 50 years.
Yeah.
When you look back at being married to a woman that long, what are some of the lessons learned or advice you could give to people who are just starting out in a marriage as something that you should try to stick to or impart on your journey to last 50 years? 50 years is a long time. 50 years is an accomplishment because, it just every year that goes by, divorce just becomes a very common thing.
Yeah.
And less of a judgmental, not that that's ever right, but it used to be that you're kind of like, they got divorced. Now it's just like, it's almost applauded if you get it. Well, they got divorced. It wasn't working.
Yeah. One of the greatest challenges, I think, to us as we age is not to become caricatures of ourselves. we have a tendency, if we have a character trait of some sort, to build that trait out so that it becomes more dominant. It becomes who we are. And anything drawn out too far, it's one thing to have a character, it's another thing to be a character. And, you know, if we're not careful, we can become cartoons of ourselves. And I think a good marriage is one where the partners help each other temper the tendencies that each individual has, so that we don't take them too far.
So then my next obvious question is, how has your wife helped temper you, or in what way has she done that to ensure that you don't go down the road that you don't want to go down? Or
Yeah. Or to go down the road that I did want to go down
Correct.
and shouldn't have. No, it's again a matter of respecting the partner, listening. Who is this person? What's important to her? How do I balance off that with what I think is important to me? And where are the trade-offs possible? And without sacrificing one's integrity, to temper some of the tendencies that we might have. And, you know, that's a mutual process. And I think as a consequence, we end up as better, more understanding, tolerant people than we otherwise might be left to our own devices.
I think what I hear out of that is communication, a lot of communication, and the ability to listen to what the other person is saying.
Yeah. But again, without losing one's own integrity. And you know, that's where the ability to compromise comes into play. And there are those individuals, you know, who would relate to Frank Sinatra singing "I Did It My Way," who would say, no, you know, if you're compromising, you're giving up too much. You're giving up, she's giving up, and neither of you ends up with what you want. Well, sometimes, quite often in fact, again, if you temper what you want and bear in mind how it affects others, then you end up as a better person as a consequence.
How has fatherhood been?
I'm sorry?
How has fatherhood been, being a father?
Like most fathers, I suspect, in retrospect, I wish I had spent more time with my family, with my daughters as they grew up. You know, I was perhaps more career focused than I could have been. And, you know, you never get those years back. You don't get a redo as you see your children develop. Now, as it turned out, they turned out a real credit to themselves. But I wish I had been more engaged, perhaps. The plus, and I rationalize perhaps here a little bit, the plus, though, is that because I was often otherwise engaged in career or studies, they developed some of the independence of character and thought that I think serves them really, really well in their lives and careers now. We hear or read in these days of so-called helicopter parents who keep tabs on every move, every saying, every thought, every friendship that their children have. And they intervene to make sure everything happens the way the parent thinks it should be. Those parents are not doing their children a favor. There's a golden mean somewhere between indifference and over commitment that helps children become who they can be. Given the way the girls have turned out, one an elementary school teacher, the other a social worker, they've done well.
What was one of your biggest fears of your children?
The fear that they would not realize their individual potential. That they would make some dumb choice that prevented them realizing who they could become. And to their credit, they have found the right paths for them.
What was it? What did you do in order to try and prevent that from happening?
I don't know if I can claim a lot of credit for preventing that, other than to set a tone, I suppose, in the household, to the extent that I did set the tone, of high expectations, and giving them opportunities to think for themselves, and to be available to them if they needed help with something. But again, not to overimpose as a parent. If that passive approach, I guess, has anything to recommend it, then I could be credited with that to some degree.
Well, I think we best talk about Lloyd for a little bit.
Yeah, really.
Your life up until Lloyd, and this is to diminish nothing you've done in Lloyd, is fascinating. And I find your journey, how you got here, is just as important, if not more so, than the things you've imparted on Lloyd. And, one of the tough things, when you have insight into this because you were on one of the first conversations you had with me about trying to do this, and my style of doing it is, I've listened to a lot of the old archive interviews, and I laugh when I start doing them because I take that format and pretty much throw it in the garbage. Not that I don't think it works, but it doesn't work for me. And so the journey is as much the intriguing part as the actual time spent in Lloyd, even if you'd spent your entire life here. Yeah. Some of the things you've done shape how you thought by the time you got here. And that in itself is very, very interesting. And so it's taken us a while to get here, but now we're to Lloyd. And we've skipped a few things, and I hate to do that. But this is why when I talk to your board, we go, well, it should only be a 45-minute to an hour conversation. I laugh about that because I've learned 45 minutes doesn't get you very far if you want to really, truly find something out about somebody. When you first went through Lloyd, before you even came to Lloyd, what did you think?
We came through Lloyd in 1978, on our way from Manitoba to Barrhead, Alberta. And Lloydminster was an overnight stop along the way. And we stayed at a motel, still in existence, over on the Saskatchewan side.
What motel would that be?
What's the name of it now? You've stumped me on that. It's between 49th Avenue and 48th or 47th. I'll leave that part blank. But we stopped there. I was driving the U-Haul truck with our furniture, and one of the girls would ride with me, and Lois was driving our state. Well, no, it was a Dodge sedan pulling the tent trailer behind us. And so we stopped overnight in Lloyd, and there was a bit of a northwest wind or breeze on that occasion, and we enjoyed the smell wafting from the asphalt refinery. And I said to Lois, "Thank God we don't have to live here." Not knowing that ultimately this would become home. And so 10 years later, it did become home.
And what brought you to Lloyd? What was the opportunity, or what drew you back here?
Yeah, it was the opportunity. In my previous situation in the county of Barrhead, northwest of Edmonton, I was the deputy superintendent of schools. And Barrhead was a wonderful situation, but one of the things that has been a hallmark, I suppose, of my career is that I've had a tendency to look at, well, what's the next rung on the professional ladder? And, well, obviously to go from a deputy superintendent
to a superintendent
would be a superintendent. And if we use Alberta terminology, it's superintendent. If we use Saskatchewan terminology in Lloydminster, which we do, it's the director of education's job. And so it became vacant, and the board advertised. And I saw the advertisement and came for an interview, and I guess I ticked off most of the boxes that the board here had in mind, and so I was offered the job.
So over your time in Lloyd, which is no short time, you were 16 years?
Yeah, 16 and a half, actually.
What sticks out to you over your 16 and a half years then? As something maybe you could hang your hat on, or that you're most proud of?
If I were cynical, I would say survival. And 16 years is probably longer than any other director of education or superintendent in Saskatchewan or Alberta has put in. I don't know if it's a record, but it would certainly be up there. And I think that speaks to a degree of leadership and adaptability. It speaks to an awareness of context, and moving forward at a rate that is acceptable to the community, whether it's the community is represented by the Board of Education, or the community is represented by the teachers in the organization, or the support staff in the organization, or the community as a whole, as the business community or residential community that pays the taxes to support the education enterprise. And so again, I think some very positive changes took place under my watch over that period of time, and by and large, the changes were successful.
What's one of the biggest things you've seen change with I mean, obviously you had teachers reporting you and principals and that. What's the biggest change then over your time, that 16 years that you saw with that process?
I think part of the change that was most significant, and I still am delighted to see that change continue to evolve today, is a shift away on the part of teachers, away from focusing, almost in some cases, almost entirely on the curriculum, to increasingly be aware of their role as helping learners learn. Lazy teachers, or those who were caught up in a very traditional school environment, would get their program of studies and they would teach that content. Now, the fact that they were teaching it was one thing. The other side of the coin, and the question is, were the kids learning it? And were they learning it well? And in the best classrooms, they were, because the teachers were sensitive to the learning processes that their students were going through. The less competent teachers, it was much easier just to teach the content. And if the kids got it, good. If they didn't, that was their problem. Obviously, they weren't trying. And so they would be graded down, as it were. There's been an evolution in education, and it continues to evolve. And I'm delighted to see that process shift.
So is it... You are of the mindset teachers, if do the right things, more children will succeed.
Yeah.
Whereas instead of maybe the thought process, if the children want it, they'll succeed.
Yeah.
Did I say that right?
Yeah, that's certainly a part of it. If I'm being simplistic, teaching is really quite straightforward. Good teaching is a matter of being aware of the curriculum and the things that are to be taught. But good teaching is a matter of reading the students. So what does this child, and each child is individual, what does this child understand about this particular concept, whether it's math or reading or social studies or science or what have you? Where is that child's mind now vis-a-vis that content? And how can I, as a teacher, stimulate the child to frame what he or she knows, and then to ask the questions that cause him or her to question what he thinks he understands or she understands? And then you make available the resources that will allow the student to evolve, to grow from what they thought they knew to something more sophisticated and refined. That's what good teaching is. But it can't be done without engaging the student as a person. You have to respect the student first and foremost, enough to ask the question, okay, so where are you in your understanding of this content? And I'm going to adapt this so that that's the starting point. If I don't adapt it, if I'm just trying to communicate some concept that's out in left field, the kid might, by rote, memorize temporarily and then regurgitate for an exam or test or what have you. and then it's gone. You have not succeeded as a teacher in that case. But if you've helped that child's understanding to grow and given them a basis to let them grow even further, you've done your job.
Did you like being a teacher then, or did you like being the superintendent?
I liked being the superintendent. And part of the reason for that is that I really don't like to be locked into rigid routines. I like to be able to choose what I want to focus on at any given time. And the independence, I guess, quasi-independence, that came with being the principal or the superintendent or the director of education. I had more latitude, I guess. Again, that element of independence, of character, came through a wee bit there.
That's interesting. What about, well, let's, my brain is going 12 different ways. What about Jack Kemp School? There was something that you had played a part in helping build, I believe.
Yeah. We took the process from the very beginning, which unfortunately involved the replacement and demolition of the old Neville Goss School. Jack Kemp School became its replacement. The old Neville Goss School at one time was the high school in Lloydminster and then converted to an elementary school. And it became somewhat decrepit, despite really good maintenance practices in the school division. And it just needed to be replaced. And as is the case with so many buildings, it costs more to renovate and bring up to code an old structure than it does to start from scratch on a new one. And so that was the impetus, and it was a matter of acquiring the land for the school site, which was an interesting process in itself. It took a lot of negotiating with the then landowner, and then figuring out the optimal design for the school, the building itself. And again, if you were to go over to that building, you would find one that is very, very functional. It's very well built. It's going to last 100 years without any problem. And it was built with durable surfaces and all of those good things that make it easy to clean, etc. The provision was there for the addition of relocatable classrooms if and as needed, and they were needed. I negotiated with the city of Lloydminster to pay for part of the gymnasium because the building guidelines in both Alberta and Saskatchewan provided for a pitifully small gym for an elementary school, totally unsuited to the needs. And so I was able to work with the city of Lloydminster, and we agreed that if the city paid for effectively what was adding 50% to the allowable size, if you like, that we would ensure that the gymnasium was always available for after-school use for community recreation activities. And the city was wise enough to make that investment, and as a consequence, we have a very good gymnasium over at Jack Kemp. So yeah, I'm pleased with that design. It's going to be there much longer than some of the throwaway buildings that are being constructed nowadays for school purposes.
What's one of the biggest changes you've seen in Lloyd over your years here?
In the city or
Yeah.
in the school system?
I think in the city.
In the city, we've become bigger. And bigger is not necessarily better. If you read Greek philosophy at all, you'll read Aristotle saying that the ideal size of a city is about 10,000 people. Because in a city of 10,000, you have enough population to have all of the services and opportunities one might want, but you're also small enough to be intimately involved in its governance. As Lloydminster had about 17,000 people in 1988 when I came here, and we've grown to, we were over 30,000, goodness knows what it is now. And with that increase in size, I've found that people are becoming ironically more distanced from each other, even though we've got more population. There isn't the degree of involvement. For example, take a look at involvement in service clubs in the community. Many of them struggle nowadays to get people to join and participate in the activities. Churches, not that I'm a churchgoer, but churches, find it more difficult to fill the pews and, to be the influences that they once were in the community. People have become more distanced from each other, even though there are more of us here. And there's a loss there. And, even in city administration, I've noticed the organization has become much bigger, much more bureaucratic. Even the school division, after I left, added more staff, more people doing specialized duties, and just making it a more complex bureaucracy. And I think there's a tendency to lose that human interaction in that kind of a context.
What was Lloyd like then when you first came and it was 17,000 people? Did they have pavement everywhere? What did you do for fun when you came here? I mean, you're a guy who's went to a place, it's interesting to watch. You talk about progression, and that's what it was. You started on a community of 100, and it went to 200, then 1,000, then, and you end up in Lloyd as kind of the culminating, the final act, so to speak. And you get to a place that has 17,000 people. What were the highlights of moving to Lloyd at that time in 1988?
Moving to, and I'll contradict myself, the fact that, Lloyd had 17,000 people and the town of Barrhead, where we lived, had almost 3,000. There were more amenities here. There was a movie theater that actually had multiple theaters within it, unlike the single theater facility in Barrhead.
A long ways from Collins, where you were showing movies in your one-room school.
Exactly, yeah. And so there were those physical amenities that were, nice to have. And again, the challenge of working in our unique bi-provincial setting here. And bear in mind, I had worked, as a teacher and had my certificates from Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, and then Saskatchewan when I moved here. I've had a chance to see different contexts. And if you don't, my kids and grandkids, I'm sure, are sick of me hearing me say this from time to time. But you never ask the goldfish what she thinks of the water. And the significance of that is that the goldfish has been in that little bowl all her life. She knows nothing else. So the water is what the water is in that bowl. And it's important to have other perspectives to bring on situations. In the education context, it was helpful, I think, challenging and frustrating to many of our teachers, I'm afraid, at the time. It was helpful for me to bring some of the perspectives that I'd learned in especially Manitoba and Alberta to the Saskatchewan context here. Because, frankly, this Saskatchewan education culture had become very complacent and very self-satisfied. And people didn't challenge each other very much to change or improve or modernize. There was a great emphasis on interpersonal relationships among teachers, with their principal, with their superintendent and director, and with the Board of Education, and with the Department of Education. And we're all very comfortable with each other. We know each other well, and we know we're good people, and so we don't have to change anything. Because good people must be doing good work, right? Well, not necessarily. Good people perhaps could do better work. And they need to take a step back and ask themselves, so what are we doing, and how does it compare with what things are being accomplished by others? And so that was one of the greatest challenges in coming to Lloydminster, into what had become a very comfortable work environment, professional environment, and one that hadn't been moving forward in terms of keeping up with curriculum development.
Being a guy who would be deemed an outsider, was it a comfortable situation coming into, or did you have some tough years of slugging being that guy?
They were always tough years. But again, as we've discussed, I've very often been the outsider.
Actually, all your life you've been the outsider. Yes.
Yeah. And so I had learned to cope with that, again, to the annoyance quite often of people I worked with. But that's who I was.
How did you cope? What do you mean cope?
By paying attention to people, to listening to them, by politely disagreeing sometimes, by challenging them, by, for example, on international achievement testing that was done periodically, Canadian provinces would have schools participate, and schools from different countries around the world would essentially, write the same exams at comparable grade levels. Canada tended to be among the top half dozen, typically. But within Canada, Saskatchewan consistently was in the bottom third in terms of student achievement. Ability to read, ability to solve mathematical problems, ability to write coherently.
So you saw that as a challenge to improve that?
Yeah. And again, the very idea of using external benchmarks to measure local achievement was something that was totally foreign and very threatening to the educators, to many educators, not all, in the community, because they thought they were doing quite well, thank you very much. And, who are you to come in and change the way we've always done things? But change was needed. And again, there were flaws, I admit, in the testing program, because Saskatchewan had nothing like standardized testing as a province at that time. And so I arranged for the Alberta tests to be used in our schools. Now, it can be reasonably argued that the Alberta curriculum is a little different from the Saskatchewan, and that's true, but not substantially different. And when it comes to basic skills of students, really they should measure up to similar standards. But the very idea of bringing in an external standard, you don't trust me as a teacher to evaluate my own kids and give them the mark? Well, yeah, I trust you if you're using appropriate criteria. So let's talk about the criteria. And if they're not really well defined, well, then let's get some benchmarks where we can find them. And let's pay attention to what they tell us. Unfortunately, there's a tendency among many teachers, and I don't want to use too broad a brush here because Lloydminster has had and does have some excellent teachers. But there's a tendency when a different idea, a new idea is put on the table, there's a tendency for some teachers, all right, if we have to adapt or adopt this change, we'll adopt it and we'll throw out what we were doing before. No, you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Take the best of this idea, marry it with the best of what you have been doing, because you have been doing some things very well, and everyone's going to be better for it. But to find that balance between change that is disruptive and change that is productive, that's a hard balance to strike. And that was the challenge to leadership.
Change is always, there are very few people who like change. So change I can see that as people find that threatening.
Yeah.
That's an easy thing to connect the dots there. I wonder, over your lifetime now, when you look back at everything you've done, what was your favorite decade? What span of time did you enjoy the most?
I'm living it.
Your 70s?
Yeah.
What about it then?
I suppose if one were to use a building metaphor. It's not perfect. You know, as you live your life, you're constructing something. You're building it. And hopefully as you're building, you learn the skills and wisdom, hopefully wisdom at some point, that comes along with that stage of life. And if you make a point of it and not become lazy, intellectually lazy, if you keep reading, if you keep thinking, if you keep current with developments in the world, if you keep engaged with your community, you grow. You know, when I was writing the family histories, and I was doing the section, and I left it to the end, the section on me. I just added that in because I started with grandparents at that level. One of the choices I had to make was what picture, if I had to choose a picture to put in this document that was the picture of Don Duncan, which picture would it be? Would it be the youngster toddling down the street as a 2-year-old? Would it be the 16-year-old in Sea Cadets? Would it be the young teacher up in the bush? Would it be the student at the University of Alberta? Would it be the director of education? Who is this person? And I guess, although I was each and every one of them, I'm now the sum of them. I'm different from each of them. And I've benefited, I hope, from some of the insights that each of those stages of life gave me. And I'm delighted at this stage in my life to have the time to read and reflect, to learn, and to try and round out a little bit what little I know.
What then, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what would you, if you could sit down and have a conversation like this?
Yeah.
You sit across from young Don. Don's sitting there. He's full of piss and vinegar. He's on his way out into the bush. What piece of advice would you give him?
Be humble. Don't presume that you've got the answers for other people. Be humble, but be engaged. And if you can try to provide some leadership and make a situation better, be engaged.
Finally, what is the biggest one event you've witnessed, read about, seen, whichever way you want to take it, over your lifetime? What is the one thing that sticks out? Which is probably pretty tough on one thing. But if you had on a world scale, what is the one thing that you go, I remember I was sitting here, I could not believe this just went down?
Yeah. Well, it's not so much an event as a process, and the extent to which we're degrading the only planet that we have to live on, that's what I've been watching and realizing that the standard of material life that we have come to expect and demand is outstripping the capacity of the planet to support it. And as population increases around the world, and we're at something better than 7 billion people now, we're using the world's resources at a rate that would require 3 planets to support on a sustainable basis. And that's terrifying. You may have read that I spent a little bit of time in India.
I did.
I was there for 5 weeks. And one of the reflections, I guess, again, as the outsider observing, was I really hope that I am not seeing our future here. With overpopulation, poverty, terrible living conditions, inordinate disparity of wealth with concentration of wealth in the hands of very few and abject poverty on the part of the many. I hope I'm not looking at our general future. And I'm not sure that I see the wisdom among our leaders today to anticipate the challenges that we face and to figure out ways of dealing with them constructively. It's concerning. And again, it's not going to be easy to change our culture to the point where we address some of the issues meaningfully. Maybe we have some chances now. The lessons that we can learn from the current pandemic situation may be helpful. But unfortunately, there are always demagogues out there who blithely promise to lead the people back to an imagined golden age that probably never existed. And if we try to accomplish that image of a golden age, we're going to need 5 or 6 planets worth of resources to support those wants. And those 5 or 6 planets simply are not there.
Then what does the average citizen do?
The average citizen is going to have to get his nose out of his mobile device. He's going to have to see him or herself in the context of a challenging environment, social, political, economic, and physical, and be willing to make some changes. The problem, well, there are different problems. It's awareness. And again, to come back to the challenges that come with modern communication. Even recently in Lloydminster, we had 2 local newspapers. We had a local television station. That television station had an hour-long news program every night of the week that featured the important things that were taking place in our community.
Even go smaller than that in Hillmond, where I grew up, which was a farming community.
Yeah.
Had a part in the paper that was written by a local woman.
Precisely. There was that engagement, a recognition that where we live is vital to how we live.
And important.
And very important to us. And so now, though, if you want news, where do we get it? Well, the newspaper, there's only one sort of now, and it really doesn't have much in the way of full-time reporting staff. They're essentially on a gig type assignment. There is no such thing as local news to speak of on the local television station. Even local radio, the content has been farmed out to the multinational.
We could probably go down this road for 2 hours, 10 days.
Yeah.
Because I was just saying, Wayne FM.
Yeah.
For a few years there, their show was lackluster, and now it's gotten better. It sounds really good.
Oh.
But you'll notice they never say, hey, we're coming live from Wainwright.
Yeah.
Because what they've done is they farmed it out to their top talented team in Calgary or Vancouver, wherever they're at. I have no idea.
Right. Yeah.
And they never say they're in Vancouver. They never say they're in, well, maybe they say Alberta, I'm not sure. But when you listen to them, they're very good at never saying where they are.
Yeah.
Which is great. I mean, you get the top talent on your local station, but you get none of the local to it.
Yeah. And you see, this is part of, and unfortunately, I don't think I'm not a one to see conspiracy theories. I'm one, though, that recognizes that organizations take on lives of themselves, and in the entertainment industry, they have become much more professionalized and much more concentrated, and they've gotten away from the local coverage to something that is much more general, much more corporate, much blander, much less controversial, much more soothing, much less thought-provoking for their audience, much less offensive to the potential sponsors. And so everything becomes a whitewashed shade of something neutral. And the consumer of that, the person who turns his radio on or TV set on or listens to something on a smart speaker, and I'm guilty of all of the above.
As am I.
You become soothed away from your environment. You're not stimulated, you're not goaded to become engaged politically in the affairs of your community or the affairs of your province or country. And we're just settling into a very comfortable, blissful situation where we're giving up so much of our character and independence of thought. And if you read, again, I'll name drop here. There's a series of books by a chap from Israel, educated at Cambridge, an historian. Harari is his name. And he wrote 3 books in a trilogy. Sapiens, that takes a look at the evolutionary history of in people and societies. Homo Deus, that looks at the ability of people now to create their environment. And again, this gets into the potentially dangerous potential of artificial intelligence and so on. And then the last book in his series is 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And if I could write a book, if I were smart enough to do that, that's the book that I would have written, I think. Again, it's a matter of appreciating ourselves as individuals in a context. And if you just lose yourself into that warm comfort of corporate blandness that Stingray music would give us, then you've lost opportunity to become something. it's not a pretty picture.
Well, that's where we're going to stop. I really have enjoyed this. Obviously, I've kept you talking for a long time. I was very, reading your story, I was very interested to hear about your journey. And I've gotten to do just that, and it's been a very, very enjoyable couple hours. So thank you for coming in and sitting down with me. And I guess you're part of the board that helped put this in motion for me to be sitting here and to sit with people such as yourselves. And I've really enjoyed the first 4 conversations I have had, and I really do look forward to the ones to follow. But in particular, Don, thanks for coming in and sitting down.
It's been a great pleasure.
Hey folks, thanks again for joining us today. If you just stumbled on the show and like what you hear, please click subscribe. Remember, every Monday and Wednesday, a new guest will be sitting down to share their story. The Sean Newman Podcast is available for free on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever else you find your podcast fix. Until next time.